Well, good evening. So good to see you. For those who I've not yet had a chance to meet, and there aren't many, but there are one or two. My name's Gareth Hill. I have the real joy of being the minister here at Romsey Methodist Church. And we are delighted that folk have come from across the district to join with us this evening as we wrestle with this question of justice and how to be people who engage in God's justice for the world. I was just saying to Rachel before we came out that it's an illustrious evening. 2 former vice presidents of conference here and the former president of Methodist Women in Britain. So you are in exalted company. This is one of those former vice presidents is Rachel. Great Rachel and I have known each other for a number of years. We worked together at Methodist Church House in London. And it's such a joy to know that she is running this Walking with Micah project for us and with us. So without anything else, I'm just going to say, please, Rachel, come and lead us through. We're delighted you're here.
What Gareth didn't mention is that we have known each other for a number of years, but he's also my former boss. So when your former boss invites you to come and speak, you jump on that train. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and how lovely to be in a room of people again. And I'm gathering there may be some people watching online as well, so also just to say it's lovely to be with you as well, in a slightly more distanced way. I want to start with a quote that you might recognise. Am I pointing in the wrong direction? Try again. There we go. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learnt that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours. Before we knew it, somehow we do it. This poem was the one that was written for and performed by the youth poet laureate Amanda Gorman at the presidential inauguration just over a year ago. An incredibly powerful moment where a young black girl stood up outside the Capitol building where there had been the insurrection just a few weeks ago. And she said that she described herself as a skinny black girl who was descended from slaves and dreamed one day of being a president, only to find herself reading for one. An incredibly powerful moment. But what she said here talks about of what just isn't always just is. We've got lots of different ideas of what this word justice means. This is a visual from a webinar that I helped with this week of people just putting in words they associated with justice. And you see the kind of whole range of words. We limited people to one word mostly, but you can see the range of things that people are describing. But it's not just words. The concepts that we have, that we're associating with justice, sorry, I just need to rearrange my ear for a moment, differ. It's all right, I think. I was waving my ears around too much, clearly. Sometimes some of us are talking about legal justice, the right and wrong, the criminal, the letter of the law. Sometimes we're talking about social justice and about the human rights language and the way that this was brought into a different kind of law, of international law, of human rights law, particularly after the Second World War. And then in the last few decades, we've started talking more about restorative justice, the idea that justice can be about putting relationships right, as well as putting things back to where they were. But these haunting words of Amanda Gorman remain, of what just isn't always just is. We're living in a time of huge change. And I think there's a challenge for each of us to work out what it means to be acting justly, to live a life that is just, to do the right thing. Whether this is as individuals or as a church or as a wider society, through our government, through our relationships with people and planet around the world. I suspect that many of you came this evening with some of those challenges bubbling around in your head. What does it mean to do the right thing? You might be wrestling with those very presently. They might be something that you're kind of have more of a background thing as you come tonight. But the reason that I'm here this evening is it's something that the Methodist Church is very actively and presently wrestling with, and that's one of the things I want to explore with you. I would say front off, I'm not going to be able to give you the answers, I'm afraid. This is much more about the exploring end, as we're all wrestling with this question of what does it mean to do the right thing. So tonight, in the next half hour or so, we're going to be exploring some ideas of what justice is. We're going to be looking at what God's justice might look like, and then to explore what our different ideas of what a just world might look like in that context. So what does justice look like? Since I've started in this particular role for the Methodist Church, I've been asking various groups of people about this over the last few months. I'd like to ask you as well. Close your eyes for a moment. You don't have to close your eyes. Metaphorically, close your eyes and have a think. Can you think of an object or a place or a picture that for you sums up your relationship with justice, or possibly your experience of injustice? A particular object or place or picture. What does justice look like for you? You can open them again now. Some of these are just some of the things that people have shared with me. What does justice look like to you? Somebody's described that it looks like a can of beans. Their grandma always carried a tin of food in their handbag because as a child they had experienced hunger and had gone without within their family. So even now, as an 80-year-old woman, she never quite went anywhere without knowing where her next meal came from, and it was in her handbag. That's what justice looked like to them. For somebody else, justice looked like a mop. They had just experienced flooding for the first time. Their kitchen had been underwater and had to clear it out. And this had been a sign for them of that. But it also reminded them of the injustice faced by people who are experiencing climate change the most and the rising waters the most, but are least able to bear the cost. Justice looked like a mop. This is an image that you might recognise, which is in the Methodist art collection called the Dalit Madonna by Jyoti Sahi. And the person who chose this because it was a reminder of the racism that they experienced, even within the church. But it was also for them a sign of being made in the image of God. That's what justice looked like to them. And then there's the good old tea bag. Fair trade, of course, maybe bought from the back of the church or from the supermarket, but a commitment for this person to the well-being of people right the way around the globe, on the other side of the world, people that they would never meet, but who were part of God's family. This is my one. This is a small brooch that is from this lady here, who is my great-grandma, Jane Ann. Now, Jane Ann left school at 13 and she went into service. And she went into service as a housemaid in one of the local big houses. And the lady of the house who interviewed her said, "I'll call you Mary. I call all my housemaids Mary." And Jane Ann, at the age of 13, said, "My name is Jane Ann. I've been baptised." Oh, that was a bit brave, wasn't it? For your first job. And amazingly, she kept her job. And the family story is that in this particular house, the future housemaids were allowed to have their own names, and the lady actually learnt their names. It's a very small story. But for me, this badge, the brooch, are about Jane Ann, who, as a 13-year-old girl, asserted her dignity as a person and as a child of God. And it speaks to me of the courage that it sometimes takes to speak up in the face of injustice. And it also helps me to remember people who would otherwise be nameless. I only found out this story when my mum gave me the brooch, and apparently nobody else in the family had remembered it at all. So I'm now telling people as much as I can so that we can remember Jane Ann and other people who might be nameless but take very brave steps for justice. Could you just talk to the person next to you and tell them what your object was in just a sentence or so? And then I'm going to ask people just to shout them out. You've only got 1 minute to do this. kinds of objects that came to mind? You don't need to tell your whole story, just tell me some of the things that came to mind. Shoes. Potatoes.
In the Irish context.
The potato famine. Curious. The church, thank you. What other ones? Law courts. Thank you. The round table. Yeah, yes.
The milk bottles that when there was an argument about people not being paid enough, went out and tried to find the most expensive one to say let's buy proper price.
Paying a fair price. Yes, yeah.
So in the American Navy, the Harvard robberies on the anniversary of the coup.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. The television. Which is one of the ways we learn about. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. There's obviously a lot of... Oh, yes.
Scales and the balance.
The scales of justice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, right. That kind of balance. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Hilary.
I'd say something like a towel, because it's something in a package given to women and refugees who have literally nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. There's obviously lots there, and there are stories behind some of them as well, which would be interesting to get into. Reflecting the number of experiences of justice and the ideas of justice, there are as many as there are in this room. We only touched on the surface of those, but I'm actually guessing that some of the stories behind those are probably really very profound. Some of you will have come from a personal story, possibly from our own painful experiences of injustice. Some of them will have been sparked by someone we know, where justice or injustice will have had a face. Not one I met, but has a face. And some will have come from a very deep well, a lifelong commitment to a particular issue. And many of them will have a deep connection, possibly unspoken, with our own faith journey, our faith experience. Our justice image is part of our testimony. And I'd love to hear some more of those testimonies one day. But hold that image as we talk through this evening. The first thing I want to talk about is why sometimes it's very difficult to have conversations about justice. As soon as we start going into why these things are important to us. You may have realised that when you spoke to somebody, you didn't really think the thing they were talking about was just or unjust. That sometimes happens. The trouble with justice is that it's a very deep word, but it's a very catch-all word. Who can disagree with the word justice? We all like justice. Nobody's going to be against justice, are they? The trouble is that we do agree profoundly. Let me give you some examples. Oh no, am I going the wrong way? There we go. So, we have some quotes. Basic point of principle and natural justice you should not be able to take out before you put in. This is about justice, not charity. Work, care, equality, security, that's what I mean by justice. Fairness, where the rules are the same for everyone, no matter how wealthy or well-connected they are. Might not surprise you. These are from speeches from the different party leaders, taken from manifestos or from speeches to conferences. We can all talk about justice or its baby sibling fairness very happily. But we have different ideas, different underpinnings, and we really don't agree what it's all about. So just to give you an example, the spare room subsidy. Back in 2013, this was an amount that was removed from people's benefits, from their kind of housing benefit payment, because the government argued that it was unfair that those on benefit should have more than those in low-paid work. It was fair, it was just. Those who campaigned against it didn't call it the spare room subsidy, they called it the bedroom tax. because they argued that it was profoundly unjust to force single parents or carers to move house and to lose the extra space they need and to be forced out of the area that they called home. You might be able to tell from my voice which side I was on in that conversation. Both sides thought they were doing something that was completely fair, completely just. We totally disagreed with each other and could not see what the other one was talking about. So disagreements about this kind of contested and slippery notion of justice are at the heart of a lot of disagreements in our society today. And because we all believe that we're just and therefore we are right and good people, this is what leads to conflict. Because justice is often about distribution, about goods, about access, about rights. And when we're living in a context of scarcity, of any kind of scarcity, arguments about which people are due what and why tend to explode. The theologian Duncan Forrester wrote, "Ideas of justice become weapons to be used in social conflicts." We actually take up our ideas of justice in order to batter other people with. Philosophers have obviously argued about different theories or models of justice for thousands of years. Now, I've not got thousands of years, you'll be glad to know, and I'm not a philosopher either. But I want to just describe some of the models or the lenses that we tend to adopt, perhaps subconsciously, and how these shape our perceptions of justice. So, for example, justice can be about maximising welfare or prosperity, or it can be about respecting freedom of choice, or it can be about cultivating virtue. And none of these fall neatly into party political lines at all. Let me tell you a story. Here you'll see a picture of a hurricane. The political philosopher Michael Sandel uses this as an example in his book. And he talks about price gouging after Hurricane Charlie hit Florida. In the wake of the hurricane, some businesses dramatically raised the prices of goods that were needed by those who were made homeless in the storm. So think about things like chainsaws or generators or ice, because it was very hot. And arguments about whether that kind of price gouging, as it's called, putting prices up just because you can, were based on very different ideas of justice. The people who were relaxed about price gouging and didn't think it was an issue supported unfettered markets. So they argued that if you allow kind of free markets, they promote the welfare of a society as a whole. They give incentives for somebody who might be wanting to sell a generator over here to come in and make money. So instead of selling the generator over here, they'll actually bring it to the hurricane hit area and sell it off. And people would bring in ice, and they'd bring in chainsaws if they can make money from it, and that actually benefits the people. Free market respects individual freedom, they would say. Instead of imposing a value and saying you can't sell that for twice as much, it's only worth this much, people have got a freedom to choose how much they pay. But the opponents of price gouging, now they argued that the welfare of the society as a whole certainly isn't benefited by allowing people to charge an exorbitant amount for the chainsaw or the generator or the ice. Because those who can least afford it, those who've just had their houses ripped off their heads, are facing genuine hardship and aren't going to be able to pay 3 times the amount for a generator. And nor is the market truly free, because buyers under duress have no freedom at all. So you see, here we have 2 very conflicting ideas of what justice looks like. And they are also people deploying arguments about what welfare looks like, the welfare of the society, and what freedom looks like. But there's also another lens. Perhaps you feel a sense of outrage if you hear in a hurricane devastated area that somebody's selling something for 3 times the amount they sold it last week before the hurricane hit. A kind of outrage at people who decide to profit from a situation where people are desperate. Now, this kind of moral outrage, this moral anger at the greed, perhaps, in this situation, is another view of justice. This is the view that greed isn't just bad for individuals, it's actually bad for the whole of our society. And excessive greed is actually a vice that our society should discourage rather than reward. This is the virtue argument, cultivating virtue argument for justice. What Sandel terms cultivating the attitudes and the dispositions, the qualities of character on which a good society depends. I think we'd agree with that. But the question about what virtue looks like and whether a society actually has a role in promoting a particular view of virtue, well, that's divided debate for millennia. So in history, in our society, this notion of justice is contested. It often doesn't come above the surface, but we have these different lenses, these different models for what we believe individually or as groups within society is just. We might use the same language. We might honestly believe that we are pursuing justice, but these different models, of which welfare and freedom of choice and virtues are just three ways of cutting this particular cake, mean that we often end up in conflict. And this raises the second thing I just want to explore with you briefly tonight. And that's the issue that we don't actually stand outside of this debate. We might like to think sometimes that we stand on the top of a mountain and we're able to look out with a great neutrality across a debate and be able to decide what is just in this particular situation. But we really don't. Sometimes we may be in the experience of being at the heart or the heat of the injustice. We may experience the marginalization, the discrimination, the denial of our rights, and we will view a situation of injustice from inside. It might give us a close-up understanding, and the line between victim and perpetrator will be very sharp, and that will impact on us as well and will frame our view. And for many people for whom this is their experience, we may have a very clear insight into the problems, but we are diminished by that experience. And sometimes the effect of the damage is that we can't always see how others are suffering. For others, our place, our position will be in a place of power and of privilege. We just may not see, we may not hear, we may not be aware of the realities of injustice and, crucially, how we benefit from them, how we are tied up in them as well. Sometimes what we may experience as injustice might be a withdrawal of privilege. The saying is, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels unfair. And that's often hard to see in one's own position. I come from a family of cyclists, and if you're not a cyclist, you may not have picked up on this. You might have done. The new highway code that's come out, there's been a real palaver about it, and some media outlets have been presenting it as cyclists taking over the world and being allowed to ride 8 abreast in the middle of the road, 3 miles an hour. And that's how it's presented. It doesn't say that. Have a look. When you have ridden down a road and been close passed by a lorry that is honking at you because they don't think you have the right to be there, you're quite glad, actually, if you're told that you are allowed to ride in the middle of a lane at places where it's dangerous and people shouldn't be overtaking you. And that's a bit of the difference. If you are experiencing oppression, it doesn't feel that way. If you're experiencing privilege, any rectification, any rebalancing of relationship might feel like oppression to you. So some of it is starting to say, where are we in this? How is our perspective being affected? But rarely are we completely victimized by injustice or benefiting from it. And many of us will have experienced that intersection in our lives through different ways that we lived, who we are, and our different experiences. And many of us will have insight into the intersectionality between justice and injustice. But when we're thinking about justice, becoming aware of where we're starting our engagement and what our own interests are is crucial, but it may not necessarily be easy. So, 20 minutes in, I'm now going to start talking about the Bible. But I thought it was very important to get out, first of all, the idea that justice is contested for all sorts of different reasons and the models that we bring, but also recognizing our own standpoints. When we think of the Bible, there may be all sorts of different stories from the Bible that speak of justice. You might think about the parables. You might think about the unjust judge. You might think about Jesus' healing ministry and Jesus noticing people who went unseen in society. You might think about Jubilee. You might think of what the prophets said. You might think about creation and people being made in God's image. There are so many stories in the Bible about justice. But crucially, the Bible doesn't set out a theory of justice that we can receive and apply and walk away and have done with it. This year's Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book is called Exploring Justice. And it's great. If you're not doing a Lent thing already, that might be an interesting one to read. And she says this: if we only use one story in the Bible as a definitive statement on justice, we distort the biblical witness as a whole, and we reduce justice to a monolithic concept rather than a vocation to be worked out in every time and place. And it's that word vocation, I think, is really helpful as well. The word justice comes from all sorts of places in the Bible. All sorts of words are translated as justice and righteousness, and those can be explored. But this idea that justice is a vocation and we need to wrestle with it in a particular time and place is very helpful when we're thinking about Bible stories, which are very much from a time and place and people. Wrestling with stories is always going to be fun. But that's not to say we don't learn anything from the Bible at all. There are lots of hints and things that we can pick up to work with and be challenged by and inspired by in the Bible. But don't pick up everything in the Bible and just imagine that gives us a nice, easy route. We get glimpses, don't we, that God's idea of justice may be very different from human ideas of justice. We just need to think of, well, the whole of Job, really, or the labourers in the vineyard. What does God's justice look like in those stories? And we also need to acknowledge that some biblical texts that claim the name of justice are actually about revenge or genocide. But having said that, we do have stuff to aid us in our wrestling. These are just some of the ones that I'm enjoying at the moment, and I share them with you. There will be others that you will want to say to me. That would be great. So, first of all, we begin with the idea that justice is from God. God's nature is just, right from the creation story. And we read that humans were created in God's image. It's beautiful. And if God is righteous, God can't do anything other than try to put things right. And if we are followers of God and we are reflecting God's image and God's nature, that's who we are as well. So that's my first bit that I enjoy wrestling with from the Bible. What does it mean to be reflecting God's nature where we can't do anything but work for justice? The second one, Desmond Tutu, I think it said, if you tore out all the pages from your Bible that talk about justice, your Bible falls apart. And there is so much in there, and so much that talks about, for example, the prophets, the widow and the orphan and the stranger, the most vulnerable people in society. So God is a God of justice and is concerned about injustice, particularly as experienced by the oppressed and the marginalised and the poor. This is a theme that's constantly taken up by the Psalms and the prophets and the life and teaching of Jesus. All people are made in the image of God. But when God's image in one person is denied, it's denied for all of humanity. Then there's the theme of liberation. Exodus, we hear God hearing and feeling the cry of an oppressed people. And this cry for liberation, justice as liberation, has been echoed by oppressed and enslaved people throughout history. And what we have received from the whole of liberation theology as a way of learning from people and feeling the cries of the oppression of people who for whom that is real. Justice is about a struggle. And we feel that struggle when we are connected with people for whom injustice is real. If justice is not about a struggle, it suggests we do not have that connection. In the wisdom literature, we learn that upholding justice is a prime responsibility for those in power. Wisdom is wisdom for justice. I just leave you with Isaiah 59. Justice is turned back and righteousness stands at a distance, for truth stumbles in the public square and uprightness cannot enter. And then justice is about right relationships, because that relationship is at the heart of who we are and our relationship with God. When the prophets, and the prophet Micah is telling people about the damage that is being done to the poorest and the most vulnerable in society, what he is doing is calling people back to the covenant, reminding people of their relationship with God and what this relationship promises. He's calling them back into relationship with God. And when they come back into relationship with God and do justice and love kindness and walk humbly with God, that's what true worship is. And justice is about the rightness of being. Shalom is obviously most often interpreted as peace, but it's more widely about how things are as God intends them to be. And this includes our physical well-being, our relationships, our mental well-being, our relationships with God and each other, and our personal character. A rightness as God intends things to be. A full flourishing of God's people. And what that means is that when there is any kind of injustice, there isn't shalom. And then, next to last, justice is about a reconfiguration of power. So much of what we learn from the life of Jesus is about turning these expectations of power on their heads. Where he's born, who he speaks with, who he sees, who he listens to, what his kingship is about. Power is reconfigured and reimagined justly. Now, this isn't saying that it's about letting go of power. Justice isn't about letting go of power. I was talking to somebody who works Church Action on Poverty yesterday, and he was saying, if you want to achieve justice, how are you going to do it if you don't have power? There is a real danger that those of us with power hold it very lightly and expect those without to do without it. If people are going to be able to turn their lives around and claim justice, they need to find ways of working with power. And if any of you have come across the citizens and community organising, that is about finding your power as a group, as a community, and using it well. But this is about changing power, reconfiguring power. And then finally, justice has to be about transformation. It involves honesty and truth and restitution and putting things right and reconciliation and forgiveness in all the complexities of that word, but it's ultimately about transformation. It's not about restoring the status quo. It's about making all things new. So these are just some suggestions, and you'll see I've got an and, because I'd love to know what are the themes and the ideas and the images that inspire you and the things that you've been wrestling with as well. What's chimed for you around particular injustices or particular stories in the Bible that speak to you? But I want to finish here by saying, I want to remind you about the word that Isabel Hamley used, vocation, the idea of vocation, to be worked out in every time and place. And the idea that the Bible doesn't give us an exhaustive or all-encompassing view of justice actually acts as an invitation to participate in an ongoing struggle for justice. And that requires our engagement of thinking and reflecting as well as acting. We can't stand outside the concrete issues that our world is facing. We can't theorize or rest on the reflections of others. We can only find justice in the struggle, going back to that word. And that means that we are all activists of some shape or form. We are all acting justly. We're all part of a community that is wrestling and interpreting together. And it requires determination, but it requires humility and a willingness to make a sometimes costly journey towards justice. So what does this mean for the Methodist Church? And this is where I'm turning things back to you. The Walking with Micah project that I'm working on at the moment is helping the Methodist Church to engage with these questions, to find out what matters to Methodists, people in Methodist communities, to draw on our theology and our history and our wider Methodist family, and to listen to the experiences of people who have lived experience of injustice, and to try and bring that together and say, and therefore, what does that look like for us as a people who are called to justice? How do we enact this as a church over the coming years? So we've just launched the Justice Conversations, which are running between February and June, and you are being guinea pigs here in a very foreshortened version now, because I'd like you each around your tables to consider 3 questions, and I'll give you probably 10 minutes, if that's all right, to do that, and then we'll come back and we'll listen to some answers and have any other conversation before we wrap up. So this is what I want you to imagine. You are this person down here at the bottom. You're surrounded by all sorts of issues and concerns and injustices and questions, pressures upon you. What do you do? Where are you going? Ahead of you, you can see the city on the hill, life as it should be, people able to live their lives in flourishing and fullness. And it's working out how to get there. So I would like you to answer 3 questions. Gareth's got them written on a piece of paper, so don't worry if you can't read them. I'd like you to start with the city on the hill. I'd like you to start by imagining what a fair, more equal, life-bringing society and world looks like. Now, I don't want you to think of a string of words of free and fair and happy and, I'd like you to think of one description, for example, where every child has their own playground, something like that. What might it look like? What might a just world look like for you? Something that embodies that flourishing nature. What's getting in the way? What's the most important issue that is getting in the way of every child being able to play in a childlike way? What's the biggest issue that's getting in the way, the biggest obstacle? And then the next bit is the most tricky bit, really, because that's saying, if we know we're here and we want to go there, what's that next step? Because there are many routes, there are many responses that we can take to the current injustices. Some of them may be sticking plasters. And there's nothing wrong with a sticking plaster if it's going to stop bleeding. But again, to quote Desmond Tutu, there has to come a point where we don't just pull people out of the river, but we go upstream to find out who's pushing them in the first place. So the sticking plaster stops the bleeding, maybe, but actually, what's going to take us in the right direction of justice? And there are some responses that don't even apply the sticking plaster. Maybe they just support the status quo. They trap people where they are. Perhaps they just provide a response but don't give people the tools themselves to start taking their steps towards justice. So when you think of this last question, what's the one key action that can be taken? Have a think. Does it set you off in the direction of the just future you're describing, or does it keep you in the foothills of the status quo? That's the challenge. So, not a big question to ask you. The first one, just have a think of one thing. You don't have to describe the whole of justice, but one thing that for you might describe what a just world looks like. I'd like you to just have 1 minute of silence while you work out your answer to that question. And then round your table, choose one of them, and then answer the other 2 questions. Okay? So 1 minute of silence, come up with an answer to the first question, and then round the table, just choose one of them and come up with the answers to the other 2. Okay, so 1 minute of silence, and then I'll tell you when you can talk to each other. Okay, can I suggest you write something, grab your piece of paper, write your thoughts down, and then when you've got them written down, then you can share them with your neighbour, choose one of them, and move on to the other 2 questions. Thank you for that. That's great. Well, thank you, everybody. We're going to go around and just collect some thoughts, some feedback. The Methodist Church is hoping that local churches will be doing an exercise of this thought in slightly longer than 10 minutes. So hopefully churches around the country are going to be doing this. But if you want to either send in your feedback or give it to me afterwards, that would also be great. But this is a time for conversation. If you're watching online, I think you can turn on the chat function, use the chat function, and if you want to give a question or a comment there, then that will be relayed magically from the back. Keris is going to bring round the microphone. She will hold it for you so we don't have the microphone going back and forth to lots of different hands to stay a little bit safer. Who'd like to feedback first? Who'd like to? Hilary, and then the gentleman here.
Thank you. We focused on the issue of the equality of well-being and tried to think what the fundamental basics of life are, coming down to water and food. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to work through how you would take the journey to make sure that people across the world all had access to clean water and sanitation, because that would also affect their mental health and improve their mental health. And we were at the point of thinking, would you try and persuade governments to legislate to increase the access to clean water? And that's about as far as we got, really.
Well, you did start with one of the biggest ones there, didn't you? Yes, yeah. And obviously that's all tied up in the United Nations SDGs as well, that we're kind of in the middle of. And access to clean water is a massive gender issue as well, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you.
Really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's actually really helpful that you've started with a global one. I often, mine goes locally, and actually setting it within the context of the global challenges that we have. What I left very loose was saying one key action, and that can be by ourselves as individuals, or as churches and communities, or government, or as a kind of a planet. So, where you can pitch it anywhere within that as well. So the kind of the key actions can include getting involved with the All We Can campaign, for example, around things like this. But thank you for kicking us off on such a big scale. Yeah. Gentleman down here. Thanks, Keris.
Thank you. I think we went big as well to start with. So the thing we're focusing on is the equality of the world's resources and wealth. Yep. So, okay, that's a biggie.
Yeah.
And to get there, what's the most important is, well, one of the issues is the equal opportunity for people to have access to those resources and that wealth. And what is the key action that needs to be taken to address it? We'd only just started that bit, but eliminating discrimination between people on the basis of race, sex, age, history, whatever.
Yep. Yeah.
So, again, we started big and then...
Ended up quite big as well.
Sorry.
Yeah. And it's one of the things that the tax justice movement is trying to deal with, this kind of historic and current imbalance in terms of resource and resource shifts around the world. So, yeah, the Church Action on Tax Justice is another organisation. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Who wants to go next?
We went with Black Lives Matter, because that's easy. So we started off by saying equal opportunities for all races and ethnicities. And to get there, we felt that there is the important issue is a lack of awareness and acceptance of our own unconscious bias. We didn't have many key actions apart from education and recognition to begin with.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I went to 3 Generate this year, the kind of youth Children's Assembly and did a kind of dot voting thing. And it was absolutely fascinating. By far and away, the two most important issues were Black Lives Matter and mental health for young people. So it is a huge issue for so many of our young people. And our kind of need to be aware of that as churches as well is vast. Curious, I was just wondering whether you wanted to read out your one, actually, because that was an interesting one along the same line there. Are you all right reading it out, or do you want Nanny to read it out? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Papa's going to read it. So, the Imagine a Fair, More Equal Society and World was everyone treated like an equal all around the world, not just in the UK. The most important issue that needs addressing, Kara says, is racism. And then one key action to not do that, to not be racist ourselves, and if we see others doing it, tell them to stop.
Thank you. It's fascinating. The first few have all been about equal access, equal opportunity, equality in various ways, haven't they? Lady down here, Curious, if you're all right, jumping back into action.
Oh, sorry. Yes, ours is a similar one. It was primary and secondary education for all girls and boys, which again is mega. And one of the important issues that needs addressing is cultural viewpoints, because not all countries think that. So that is enormous. And then resources as well. And that's as far as we got.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. No, that's very. It's huge as well, isn't it? I thought you were going to say primary and secondary education in this country when we started, but that's another one, isn't it? Yeah. But again, this idea of equality, all being created in God's image, really tricky finding this next step, isn't it? Because that's the thing that sets us off in the right direction and commits us to action as well. Thank you. Who else would like to? I think Michael over there. There's a very little hand.
The picture that captured me really, and I've been trying to work out how that can help us. It was of the cyclist and the lorry on the same road, and the fact that many of us as car drivers will have huffed and puffed at cyclists ahead of us, daring to take up our space and slowing us down when we had to get somewhere. And that somehow seemed to me an image of the tussle for a place in life, and the cyclist in deadly peril of being just pushed aside and known over. So the question seems to be, with loads of the huge issues before us as human beings, whether we're prepared to give space to each other and respect each other, and somehow together try to find a way forward. I've been trying to think of other images as well, but others, I'm sure, will have thought of images that somehow speak of that tussle.
Thank you. Has anybody got an image? Anything they want to feed back there? Isabel? Thank you, Michael.
I didn't write it down, but thank you for the lead in, because it just reminds me of the 3 mile an hour walk, and how if we move at 3 miles an hour, we can engage with somebody else. That may also be moving at that same speed. And the patience and the time that it takes to do that engagement. I did have the word engagement down on the paper. The listening, the observing, and leading to the relationship. So I started small. But I think, for me, it's that one-to-one, 3 mile an hour. So thank you.
That. Yes, the 3 mile an hour conversation. Yes, and I think that's also really helpful because it is really important to think of the big stuff. It's also about the conversion of the heart, isn't it? And that is through the encounter with the other. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Any other comments people want to make more generally? Thank you.
Yes, I was.
Do you want to hold it a bit closer?
Going back to the I don't know what his name is over
Michael.
there.
Yeah.
Michael over there.
Eric, I'm so sorry.
Okay, sorry,
I was calling you your son, wasn't I? I apologise.
Well, we're now getting names sorted out. Okay. I was just thinking of giving space and place for others, and you were thinking of cyclists, and I was thinking of refugees and the image of people in boats on the channel, and the way that our selfish instincts are always catered for, but so often given the opportunity, like with the pandemic and things, there is an enormous tap of generosity and empathy within us, and it bugs me that so often politicians and people in positions of authority think they're doing right by us by appealing to our self-interest and not to the interests of the wider world or community.
Thank you.
Not sure how this will work. If I can't see how loud I am, so I'm hoping I'm coming out okay. The interesting thing about imagining a fair, more equal and life-freeing society, I guess it might be because of where we are, that the images that came to mind are actually a lot of the ways that Jesus then would describe the kingdom of God. And I guess for me, a just and fair society is analogous with that. You don't get one without the other. But then thinking that through a bit more, that also means we don't get justice in a vacuum, i.e., if we want to see justice, it also requires evangelism. And the encounter that you spoke about a second ago, that we can't divorce the two, because justice on its own, especially if you try to enforce it, doesn't work.
I think that's really, really helpful. Not now, but I think a while ago, there was the idea that you did one or the other, wasn't it? You know, you were either a justice person or you're a, evangelist. And for me, in my lifetime in the Methodist Church, one of the, real blessings is that I don't think is how we see ourselves anymore. If you scratch a Methodist, what are we about? We're about people who have a real evangelistic heart for God. We're about people who are committed to discipleship together, and we're about people who are about social action and social justice, and that is Methodism. And I think this idea that you can separate them off, it's not who my experience of the Methodist Church. And as Christians, if we are talking about the love of God and leaving out the fact that somebody is not surviving on universal credit, that is not about the whole person, is it? And if we are talking about justice, but cutting off this vision of the kingdom of heaven and this amazing invitation that we have and the love of God that is already there, that's not the whole deal either, is it? So thank you for that. I think that's really, really great. The evangelism and growth work of the Methodist Church talks about being a growing, inclusive and justice-seeking church. So it's in there. Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, any other comments in the last couple of minutes? Gareth?
Thank you. I've been wrestling, and not just tonight, but previously, with maybe the difference between equal and equitable. Mm-hmm. And the image that keeps coming back to me is there's an image of 3 boys trying to look over the fence at a football match. And in the first image, they all have the same size box. But because one is considerably taller than the others and the third is considerably shorter, one of them still can't see. So you rearrange the boxes so the very short one has 2 boxes and the very tall one doesn't have a box. And then everybody gets a view. And I'm slightly uncomfortable with the word equal, because I'm not sure equal does what we want it to do. But equitable is about when, with God, we make it not just fair, but that people can participate, people can be involved, people can help solve some of the problems themselves as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful feedback, because it's not just about a line of equality, is it? There is a fourth kind of to that particular cartoon, which it says that justice is taking down the fence so that everybody can go and join in the football match. And that is another challenge, because there is this kind of danger of a kind of a layer, isn't there, of deciding what is equal for other people or what is equitable. But I entirely take your point about that. And I think my thing about kind of more equal is possibly trying to recognise what is unequal now. But it's a good challenge, the difference between the two. So thank you. Yes, I'll take that one away and go and worry about it now. Thank you for I'm conscious of the time. Thank you for that feedback. As I say, we only had kind of 10 minutes to kind of start scratching at the kind of the top of those questions. And what I'm hoping with these justice conversations that people will be able to do in churches is that we will be able to do 3 things. So one thing that we didn't do, because that's the thing, my bad, I chopped out because we were going to run short of time. And that is to start by listening to the experiences of people who've experienced injustice. And a group of people, 8 people, have made a film talking briefly about their own experiences from all walks of life, different experiences, and then saying, and therefore this is what a just world looks like to me, and this is what a just church looks like to me, and this is how I think the church can work for justice. So in however people do it, I think starting by listening rather than speaking is a good thing. So if you do this in your own churches, all sorts of ways to do that. Secondly, by exploring where God is in this. I told you some of my ideas. I didn't give you any chance to talk about them or to tell me yours. So I'm sorry about that. But then the second bit is by reflecting on where God is in this, where for you God's story is around justice and what God's justice looks like. And then the third bit is going deeper into some of these questions and really trying to get down into the detail, and not detail so much, but really trying to kind of hone down in the light of the 2 previous ones what it does mean to live as part of a just world. What are the challenges we face, and then what direction we think the church or ourselves or our country can start moving towards justice. Because it's going to be collecting those answers together, which is what I'm hoping to do, from Methodists right the way around the country. And not just Methodists, I want to collect them from anybody who's involved in the life of Methodist communities. So it might be parents and toddlers groups or social action groups or community groups that you have meeting. How can you help them to have this kind of conversation as well? Collect this together and we can get a sense of the kinds of things that are important to people in our church communities now, and what we think need to be the priorities as well as our principles and the practices for living them out to go forward. Gareth asked me to end with an advert, which I'm always happy to do. There we go. There are lots and lots of resources online. So you can do this in all sorts of different ways. There are worship resources, all sorts, enough for a local arrangement service, but all sorts of stuff for preachers to use as well. So you could possibly end up after a service having a conversation, or after a sermon even, if you had a very short sermon. There's a guided session plan, there's Bible studies, starting with Micah, but going in all sorts of other places. People know what craftivism is. I know some people know what craftivism is. It's a way of exploring issues more deeply by slow conversation, slow thinking, and craft. So you could have one of those. There's an intergenerational session, which my colleagues, the Children, Youth and Families session group wrote, and it's much more fun. To be honest, even if you haven't got any children in the room, use that. That's great. That's much more fun. But it's really important that we do talk about these things intergenerationally. You know, we heard what we learned here, didn't we? And it's really important to hear those voices and to listen to each other, and as we have conversations about justice. And this was just to show you where you are in the process. So at the moment, we're learning from Heritage, Voices of Injustice, Justice Conversations, doing theology together in the wider Methodist family, and then that will come to conference in 2023 with suggestions about the practices and the ways that we can work this out in our church and our churches. Oh, wrong one. So thank you very much. I've loved being with you. Sorry it wasn't a whole day. I'd have loved to keep talking with you. And next time I'll be quiet and listen slightly more. But it was really good, and thank you very much. And do get in touch if you've got any questions.
Lovely. Really grateful to Rachel for coming, particularly because I think we've worked out on the trains that she gets home about 2 minutes past midnight after she leaves us here. So pray for trains to be in the right place at the right time and to get to the end of the line. That would be really helpful. We are so grateful, Rachel, because it's kind of provoked things for us. And I think that for me, the hope was that the conversations would just start those things running in our minds and hearts, and we can then do something with it. Grateful for the list of the resources, because this morning in this church, the kind of worship planning group was sitting there saying, we really need some themes, we need some intergenerational material, and you turn up and say, there it is, look, that's fantastic. If you want to talk to Rachel, we'll finish now in a second. If you want to talk to Rachel, we have about 10 minutes, and then I need to whisk her off to Winchester for the train. So let's just pause a minute. Let's be quiet, and I'll pray to end. Thank you, Father God, that your heart is for justice. Thank you that you are building a church that recognizes the call to draw people closer to Christ, and with them and with those who live around us, to build a just society. We pray that you will put this deep in our hearts and help us to model it for ourselves, for our friends, for our families. Thank you for Rachel. Thank you for the work she's doing and her commitment over 2 years. Help us to hear it. Help us to engage with it. And bless us as we go, because we ask it in the name of Christ. Amen. So if you want to catch Rachel, you have a couple of minutes. Take 30 seconds each.
Just a spark. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The valley